Good morning.
In unison, good morning, Your Honor.
In unison, good morning.
May I proceed? Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning, sir.
All right, we were, right at the end of the day, talking about exemplars. And the question about exemplars that I was getting to is it important in comparing an exemplar to a known print to determine if there are any dissimilarities?
Yes, sir, there is.
You can have quite a number of Galton points, or points that you identify as being identical, correct?
Among others, yes.
And if you have an unexplained dissimilarity, then you have to reject the comparison. Is that correct?
Yes.
Alright, so therefore, it's important to have a good exemplar, so you can see all of the features of the print, correct?
That's correct.
And it's also important to have a good latent print, if possible, to compare to the exemplar, correct?
Yes, sir, that's correct.
Alright, in other words, you have what you have. Whatever shows up as a latent is what you get to compare, correct?
Yes, sir.
But the more detail and the more of the print that you have, the better it is to compare to the exemplar, correct?
The more detail, the more positive the comparison.
Alright, now, I think you told us that you were familiar with SWGFST, is that correct?
Yes, I read their guidelines.
Alright, and that is a working group which was created in the last few years to deal with fingerprint examination and comparison, correct?
Yes.
Alright, one of the things that has arisen in the latent print examiner community is a question of whether or not there are adequate validation studies to support fingerprint comparisons, correct?
That's correct.
And that's one of the things that SWGFST was formed to address?
I'm not sure whether they were formed to address the actual lack of a validation study, but they were formed to address latent fingerprint comparison in general.
Alright, now, when you're looking at prints on paper, as you did in this case, there are some things that you can tell from prints, obviously, and other things you can't, correct?
Depends how much of the print is available. That's a correct statement.
And one of the things, though, that you can't tell from examining fingerprints is when the fingerprints were put on the object. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And if you have two sets of prints, for instance, on the same object, there is no way of telling which was placed before the other.
That's correct.
So they could be placed at totally different times, they could be placed at the same time, they could be placed at different times that are close together, correct?
That's correct.
Or different times but far apart?
Yes, sir.
Alright, now, did you have training from the specs company, SPEX?
No, I did not.
And were you aware that the sheriff's department had arranged for training from the manufacturer of the scenescope?
No, sir, I was not.
Did you have any training on the scenescope yourself?
No, sir, other than about 10 minutes of brief information I got from Detective Lafferty.
Okay, and when did you obtain that information from Detective Lafferty?
I believe it was in August of 2004.
Alright, were you advised by Detective Wittenbrock that it was not necessary to fume as extensively with super glue if you're using the scenescope?
He made a comment once that he thought some of the pages were coming out a little heavy, and that we, at that point, pulled back about a minute on the super glue exposure timing.
When you say heavy, the fuming process was then obscuring some of the detail on the prints. Is that correct?
That was his opinion, but I never got the same opinion from Detective Sutcliffe.
Alright, did you form an opinion yourself?
I never had a chance to really look. I relied on their feedback to adjust the gluing times if it became necessary.
Alright, I want to clear up a couple details. I'll make my way through here. Excuse me, may I approach the witness, Your Honor?
Yes, sir.
These are in evidence. Okay, I have put before you Exhibit 723, 726, and 748.
Yes, sir.
And on direct examination you said that 748, if you take 748. I think it's that one.
Correct.
Alright, can you hold that up, if that's all right with the court? It's in evidence, so the jury can see it?
Yes.
Just so we all know what we're talking about. 748 was a comparison board that showed your comparison of fingerprints, the exemplar to a latent print. And you testified on direct that that was the print, the image that was depicted in Exhibit 723. Would you pick up 723? That's not 723. That's 723. Okay. Looking at 723, does 748 depict the image in 723?
No, sir.
Okay. In fact, if you look at 726, that appears to be a similar image to 748. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
I take it, in fingerprint examination and comparison, it's extremely important to keep track of the exemplars and the latent prints, is that right?
Yes, sir.
You don't want to be mixing prints up, otherwise it could cause all sorts of problems, right?
Yes, because you probably couldn't make an identification if you mixed them up.
Would it cause problems if you mixed up your latent prints and your exemplar prints?
If things are not kept in the correct numerical order and name order, yes.
Okay, now, let's talk about a little bit about your training and experience. You had mentioned that you had this case accounted for. At one point you said about a quarter, and then you said maybe a fifth or a sixth of the total number of prints that you compared, correct?
Yes, sir.
And how long have you been a latent print examiner?
I started working with latent prints in 1987.
Were you a latent print trainee for some period of time?
Yes, sir, I worked under William Moore, who was a latent print examiner in our office at the time when I started. And that's when we also started working with Cal ID systems.
Alright, now, Detective Moore, was he a detective or an ID tech?
He was a senior ID technician.
Okay. ID Tech Moore was somebody who had pretty much learned the job of being a latent print examiner on the job, is that correct?
I'm not sure where he got all his training. He was in the bureau when I got there, and he was filling the position of ID technician and doing latent print examinations, and he was the one that I started training under.
Okay, and how long did you train under ID Tech Moore?
Probably about 8 years. He was in the office approximately 8 or 9 years before he retired.
And during that period of time, did Mr. Moore do most of the latent print examination for the sheriff's department?
He did a great deal of the latent print exams. And also he was the Cal ID systems operator when it was installed.
Okay, let's not go too far afield on that. But since you brought it up, Cal ID is that a computerized system to match prints?
It's a computerized, yes, that's the simple definition, yes.
Okay, and now you have some other systems like AFIS?
Well, that's what Cal ID originally was an AFIS system. We have a second or third generation of searchers and submitters now.
Okay, in any event, you did not use the AFIS system or the Cal ID system here?
No, sir. We had supplied exemplars for the 3 individuals who we were doing the latent print comparisons against.
So again, not to go too far afield, but just to understand what you said, the computer system is a way to take prints, latent prints, and see if you can find an exemplar somewhere in the system. Is that right?
To clarify, it's taking an unknown print, run it through a set of computer matchers to determine if there's a match in the system.
You could also take an exemplar print, a rolled print, and run it through the system, right?
Yes, sir, you can.
So if you arrest somebody and you want to see if their fingerprints match somebody else in the country, you could send it to the federal AFIS system to have a fingerprint search. Is that correct?
No, we don't have that capability. We send it to Sacramento DOJ or Department of Justice. And I believe at that point it could be routed through the Department of Justice to the FBI IAFIS.
Okay, and the FBI system is called IAFIS.
That's correct, sir.
So again, you could go to the State Department of Justice, and they may route it onto federal. But you have access, basically, to the whole fingerprint bank that exists in the country. Is that correct?
In one form or another, yes, sir, we do.
Alright, now, again, in this particular case, you weren't doing that, you were attempting to compare exemplar prints to latent prints that were found on these various objects?
That's correct.
Okay, now, in 1987, you started working with Mr. Moore. When did you become a latent print examiner as opposed to a latent print trainee?
I would suppose that I probably graduated into a journeyman sometime in the early 90s. 91, 92, possibly.
Okay. Now, was there some official designation? Did you get a certificate, or a letter of recognition or something? Or is it just a point that you get to where you feel you're an examiner as opposed to a trainee?
I believe it was a point where the other examiners in the office, Mr. Moore, and Doug Coleman was still there. They felt that I was sufficient in my job, that I could perform latent examinations and form conclusions.
And Doug Coleman was also an ID tech, is that correct?
He worked for the Santa Barbara County Sheriff's Department about that time before moving to the Santa Maria Police Department.
Okay, but he was an ID tech as opposed to a technician?
No, he was an ID technician also.
Right. Now, I think you said on direct examination that you're not certified by any organization as a latent print examiner. Is that correct?
That's correct.
You belong to the Southern California Association of Fingerprint Officers?
That's correct.
That's a membership organization, right?
Yes, sir.
Send in your dues, and if you're a peace officer, you can belong to it. Is that correct?
It's more civilian than law enforcement officers or sworn officers. But you have to make an application, you have to go to 3 meetings. If anybody has an objection to your membership, you will not be installed. And after the 3rd meeting, then you're installed. And then you're a member until you quit.
Alright, now, you mentioned that ID Tech Moore and ID Tech Coleman had indicated that they felt you were ready to do examinations on your own at some point in the 90s. Is that correct?
I think that's a correct statement, sir.
Were you ever subjected to proficiency testing?
Not officially. However, every time we do a latent print examination, we get a validation. That can be a form of proficiency testing.
Sir, you know what I mean by proficiency testing, is that correct?
Yes, sir. There are agencies which send in blind tests and then you do the tests and send it back and they're graded.
Were you ever subject to proficiency testing?
No, sir.
The Santa Barbara Sheriff's does not submit itself to proficiency testing in fingerprint examination. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
And are you familiar with the agencies that do proficiency testing?
No, sir, I don't know any right now who are actually doing proficiency testing from personal knowledge.
Alright, you've indicated, though, that you have gone to a number of meetings and some training sessions with regard to latent print examination, correct?
Yes, sir.
And so you attempt to keep up with the literature, as it were, in the field, is that right?
As much as possible, yes, sir.
And in the course of your training and experience, you're aware that the Law Enforcement Assistance Administration, the LEAA, federal agency, did proficiency testing. Is that correct?
No, I'm not sure.
Were you aware that Collaborative Testing Service, a private company, was contracted to do proficiency testing from 1995 to 2003?
I know they do proficiency testing. I don't know who they did it for or if they were ever contracted through anybody.
Okay. In the course of your studies with regard to latent print examination, you're aware that the proficiency testing across the country turned up a number of misidentifications, a significant number, correct?
I'm going to object. Lack of foundation, Your Honor.
Foundation, sustained.
Okay. Are you aware that there have been issues with regard to, let's just take false positives coming up in proficiency testing in this country?
I don't know what the rate of any proficiency testing was per agency or per test. No, I don't.
Okay, and your agency doesn't have any percentage or rating because it doesn't submit to proficiency testing, correct?
That's correct, sir.
Alright, now, what I'm asking about is you're aware in the proficiency testing, the blind testing that you have talked about, there have been a number of instances of false positives showing up. Is that correct?
Objection. Lack of foundation, Your Honor.
Sustained.
Are you aware of are you aware of any results? I'm not talking about the specific numerical results, but generally in your reading, in your training and experience, any results of the proficiency testing over the last few years?
Objection. Lack of foundation, Your Honor.
Overruled.
The only tests that I am aware of.
Just a minute.
Excuse me.
There's a question that just requires a yes or no answer. Read the question back to him. Record read.
Yes.
And were you aware that false positives have shown up in that proficiency testing?
I can't remember if there were false positives brought up or whether it was they just didn't send the test back. I know there was a problem.
Okay. Now, is this part of the problem? Or let me withdraw that. Is this problem that you just described part of the mission of SWGFST to try to remedy?
I'm going to object as to vagueness, Your Honor.
Let me rephrase it, because it was an odd sentence at best.
Go ahead.
Is SWGFST attempting to remedy problems associated with proficiency testing results?
I don't know.
You're also aware that in the last 5, 6 years, there have been a number of particularly notable cases in which there have been false positives. Is that correct?
That's correct.
There was one in 1999 in Scotland involving a police officer by the name of Shirley McKee. Is that correct?
I'm aware of that case. Yes, sir.
And that's a case where the Scotland Criminal Records Office, which is their law enforcement or ID tech agency, formed an opinion that there was a positive match. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And the police officer, Miss McKee, was prosecuted for murder based on that print identification. Is that correct?
No, I believe she was prosecuted for perjury.
Okay. And after the case was over, 170 other print examiners looked at the print and said they didn't match. Is that right?
I know a great number looked at the print. I don't know the exact number. But almost everybody agreed that it did not match.
Almost everybody in the Scottish Records Office to this day maintains that it's a positive ID, correct?
That's my understanding.
This is part of what you described as a subjective aspect of making print identifications, correct? In other words, people form an opinion, and that's the basis for a positive identification, correct?
Yes.
And you're also aware of the case last year involving Brandon Mayfield, is that right?
That's correct, sir.
Brandon Mayfield was a lawyer in Oregon, correct?
Correct.
And he was placed in custody for 2 months based on a fingerprint identification, correct?
I thought it was 2 weeks. That was my reading.
Alright, well, he was placed in custody long enough to be an interference with his life. Is that correct?
Objection. That's argumentative, Your Honor.
Sustained.
He was placed in custody for some period of time?
Correct.
And he was accused of being involved in the Madrid bombing. Is that correct?
Correct.
And that was based on the FBI making a positive identification of his fingerprint on something associated with that bombing. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And they had 3 FBI fingerprint, latent print examiners who compared the print and agreed that it was positive. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And they identified in excess of 16 points of identification. Is that correct?
I don't think it was a number quite that high, but I don't know the exact number, sir.
Alright. And eventually the Spanish police identified the fingerprint to an Al-Qaeda member. Is that correct?
I know they did identify it. I wasn't quite sure. I don't know who they identified it to, but I believe it was somebody involved in an organization over there.
And Mr. Mayfield? It turns out at this point Mr. Mayfield had absolutely nothing to do with it. Is that right?
I don't know if he did or not. I don't know if he was totally exonerated or whether he's still waiting.
Okay. You're aware that the FBI has indicated that they made a mistake and it was not his fingerprint, correct?
That's correct, sir.
And they, in part, blamed it on digital imaging?
Initially, yes, sir.
And then they changed that opinion about digital imaging after the fingerprint community became concerned that that would undermine digital comparisons, correct?
I don't know the answer to that question.
You're also aware of Judge Pollock's decisions in the, I don't know how you say it, Lara Plaza. It's LLERA Plaza case. Is that correct? It's an Eastern District of Pennsylvania.
I know. I read about Judge Pollock, but I don't recognize that particular case by that name.
Alright. In any event, there was a case in Pennsylvania that Judge Pollock had made a determination with regard to fingerprints, admissibility of fingerprints, correct?
In 1999, yes, sir.
Are you aware of the opinions in January and March of 2002?
Objection. Relevance and calls for hearsay.
Overruled. You may answer yes or no.
I can't say yes to that. I don't remember.
Alright. In any event, these matters that we talked about, Shirley McKee, the Mayfield, Judge Pollock's ruling, whenever it was, Those have been the subject of conversations, debate and concern in the latent print examination community. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Now, you said that you had taken a couple of courses from Sergeant Ashbaugh. Is that right?
That's correct.
In fact, one course you took was actually in January of 2005, this year. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And Sergeant Ashbaugh is a sergeant with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Is that correct?
That's correct.
He coined the phrase, ridgeology, is that right?
That's correct.
Okay. And actually wrote a book about ridgeology, is that right?
Quantitative-qualitative friction analysis, yes, sir.
And he calls it, ridgeology.
That's what he calls the system.
Alright, and his, without going into, you can go into as much detail as you want, but without going into unnecessary detail, his theory is to get away from simply matching Galton points to do something more sophisticated in analyzing prints. Is that correct?
The fingerprint community started getting away from just using strictly level 2 detail or Galton points some time ago. What Mr. Ashbaugh said was that he coined the phrase ridgeology in an attempt to explain how latent fingerprint examiners do their work, because nobody had done this up to this time, because a lot more takes place in the latent fingerprint examination than just counting, as you say, Galton details.
Alright, so he was trying to explain how latent fingerprint examiners can come up with an opinion, an ultimate opinion, that there's either a positive identification, or there's no identification, or it's inconclusive. Is that correct?
Yes.
It all goes back to a couple basics, though. Whether you go back to Galton in 1886 or you talk about Sergeant Ashbaugh, the first thing you're talking about with fingerprints is the permanency?
That's correct.
The idea that a fingerprint is permanent from birth to death absent some of the things you talked about. I mean mutilation, or something else, correct?
That's correct.
The second is that no two fingerprints will be identical. Is that correct?
The uniqueness theory, yes, sir.
So it's unique. Now, it turns out, based on experiences in the last few years in particular, that two prints can be quite similar, correct?
Two prints can be similar, but they cannot be the same.
Well, that's the theory.
I think that's a proven fact over 100 years.
In other words, over the last 100 years your position is that no two full prints have ever been found to be absolutely identical, right?
That's correct.
But there are prints, you would agree, that match on numerous Galton points, or points of identification, and yet are not, in fact, from the same person, correct?
I have seen 4 match before. I found a dissimilarity, but there can be similarities, yes.
Some of these cases involved quite a lot more than 4 points, is that right?
I'd have to see. I have seen the Mayfield prints, and I don't agree with the FBI's, the number of prints they got. In fact, I would not even have done that examination, because I don't feel that the latent print is of enough quality to even deal with.
And that's a point I was going to get to in just a minute, but let's pick it up right now. And that is, that you don't generally have a full print when you're dealing with latent prints to compare to the exemplar, correct?
Most of the time, no. But sometimes you get lucky and you do.
In this particular case, the 19 prints that you have here, were any of them a full print?
Some of them were, yes.
Alright, when you say, full, it wasn't a rolled print.
It wasn't a rolled print. But if we have the pattern area, the delta area, the ridge flow behind the re curves up from the core and down from the core, so we had quite a substantial portion of that print visible.
So, what you're saying is if you had a partial print, but you thought it was a substantial partial print.
That's correct.
Alright, and we'll get to some of those in a second. Let's talk about the ACE-V process that Mr. Ashbaugh's talked about, and I believe you say you use. Is that correct?
As far as I know, the fingerprint community uses that methodology.
Alright, and when you're talking about ACE-V, we've gone through it so I don't want to bore everybody to tears. I'm hearing twittering behind me. It may be too late. Laughter. Alright. But this is important, so we want to try to get through it as best we can. On the ACE-V, basically, A is analysis.
Correct.
So you have to look at the big picture and see if there's anything there that would disqualify the latent print from comparison, correct?
You want to analyze the latent print for quality and quantity of detail and clarity, see whether it's even usable, how much detail is available in that particular latent print.
And then you go to comparison, and that simply means that you compare the exemplar print to the latent print. Is that correct?
That's a simplified version, yes.
We're trying to be simple, but we can make it more complicated.
What you would do, you would find your target group in the latent print and see if it exists in the known print, and then work from the latent print to the known print.
Okay, now, after you do all of that, you get to the E, which is evaluation, right?
That's correct.
And that's a subjective part, right?
No, that's still your objective part.
Well, when you're comparing, during evaluation, that's when you form your opinion, right?
At the end, yes.
Okay, so when you form your, let's put it this way, at the end of the E part, evaluation, you form your opinion.
Okay, yes, sir, that's correct.
And that's subjective?
Yes, based on what you found out during the objective form of the evaluation.
So you're basically saying, I got to call it, it's a ball or a strike. It's a positive or it's not, right?
You're attempting to determine whether there is sufficient detail in the friction ridges and sequence in characteristics to individualize that particular print to your suspect or the person that you're comparing it to.
And that is an opinion, correct?
That's correct.
And people's opinions can differ.
That's correct.
Correct? And we've given some prominent examples of where opinions differ, right?
Correct.
In other words, you differ with the FBI on the Mayfield case, correct?
Correct.
I take it you didn't analyze it while he was still in custody, did you?
I saw that print initially a couple of months ago on the internet.
Okay, so you weren't in a position to call them up and say, hey, you guys screwed up on this.
I'd like to have been, but no.
And in fact, in Santa Barbara, in this particular case, you decided to do this fingerprint analysis essentially in-house, is that correct?
That's what I was told to do, yes.
Okay, and you could have, I say, you. Let me withdraw that. A determination could have been made by somebody in the chain of command from the district attorney's office down through the chain of command. Somebody could have made a determination to send the prints out to be analyzed by some other agency, correct?
That's correct.
The Department of Justice, California Department of Justice has latent print examiners, does it not?
That's correct.
And you have in the past sent prints to the DOJ to do latent print comparison, have you not? When I say, you, I mean your agency.
If we did, it was some time ago. I don't recall anything recently that I know that was sent to the Department of Justice.
Okay, but you're aware that today and in the fall of last year, 2004, the Department of Justice would provide latent print analysis services at the request of the Santa Barbara Sheriff's Department. Is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Okay, and you could have sent the prints to the FBI, is that right?
I could have, but that option was most likely available. I don't know.
Okay, and again, I don't mean you personally. But if it was decided in the chain of command, somewhere from the district attorney down through your chain of command, somebody could have made that request of the FBI. Is that correct?
I would assume so.
Okay, excuse me 1 second. Did you have any discussion with your superiors or colleagues about sending the prints in this case to the Department of Justice in Sacramento?
I, at one time, said it might be an option because of the volume of material that we were dealing with.
I take it you were overruled or it was determined that would not happen.
As far as I know, yes.
Were you involved in any discussions about sending the prints to the FBI?
No.
Now, we had Dr. Cantu from the Secret Service come to court here a little while ago. Do you know him?
I met him a week ago, yes.
He came out here to testify, and you had a chance to talk to him?
About the scene scope, yes.
Other than his coming out here to testify for this jury, did he have any other involvement or provide any other assistance to your office in evaluating the evidence in this case?
As far as I know, he did not.
And I take it the United States Secret Service also had no role in this until Dr. Cantu came out to testify here. Is that correct?
That is my understanding.
Now, I'm not going to go through everything, but what I'll do, let me come over here. What I'm going to do, if the court will permit me very loudly for just a moment, I'm going to hold up one of the boxes. Remember these boxes with the white notebooks?
Yes, sir.
And I think there were 3 or 4 of these boxes that you went through. Is that correct?
I wasn't counting the boxes. I was looking at the magazines.
Alright, but you went through quite a number of these notebooks?
Yes, sir, I did.
Alright, and after spending a couple of hours going through those boxes here for the court, the fact of the matter is, that out of all of those boxes, there were 12 magazines from which you performed a comparison that resulted in your opinion that there was an identification. Is that correct?
I'd have to look at my notes to count the number of magazines.
Do you have your notes here?
Yes, sir, I do. I have a sheet right here.
Yes. Take a look at that.
That's correct, sir.
Okay. And before you started going through each one of those, you knew which 12 were the 12 that you actually formed an opinion that there was a positive identification. Is that correct?
I object as to vague, Your Honor.
The witness looks like he doesn't understand it, so let me rephrase it, Your Honor.
All right.
Thank you. In other words, before we started going through, Mr. Nicola got up and went through each one of those binders one at a time?
That's correct.
Several boxes?
Yes, sir.
Before he did that, you would have been able to say, well, look, there's 12 of those binders in which there was a positive identification in my opinion, would you not?
That's correct.
Objection. What's the relevance to that question?
Overruled.
Now, you testified on direct examination that you used Adobe PrintShop to work with ID Tech Hemen in making comparisons of prints. Is that correct?
The correct name of the program is Adobe Photoshop, and ID Tech Hemen was the computer operator.
Okay, Photoshop.
Yes, sir.
Sorry. That's undoubtedly very important to the Adobe company. Alright, the point of the story is, as I understand it, you're saying that you were able to use 2 different layers, is that right?
Correct.
And I think you referred to them as layers, is that right?
That's what they call them in the program, yes, sir.
Alright, and so basically you can sit down, compare prints, find what you consider to be points of identification, and then you can leave, and ID Tech Hemen could come in and sit down and do the same thing and find points of identification, correct?
That's correct.
And then you took your 2 layers and you compared your analysis with her analysis, is that correct?
Correct.
Did you both identify the exact same points on each fingerprint?
The exact same basic points were identified most. Sometimes she may have identified a point more than I did. Or I may have identified a point more than she did.
And is it your testimony that you varied by 1 point on these fingerprint comparisons?
I don't know if exactly one. It could have been several, sometimes. Sometimes we were dead on exact.
So did you save the layers?
I believe they may still be in the computer in Santa Barbara.
So you haven't printed them out or given them to the district attorney or to defense counsel in this case?
No, sir.
Alright, now, you testified to a timeline, and I'm going to ask the clerk if she has that. I don't have the number written down right here. Do you have the timeline?
Mr. Nicola has that.
Oh, Mr. Auchincloss has it. Alright, that's 622. And your timeline. Can I put this up, Your Honor? I believe it was received.
Yes.
And let me see. Your timeline starts in January of, the printed timeline starts in January of 2004, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you basically show your involvement commencing in August of 2004, correct?
That's when I first obtained the first piece of evidence, yes.
And you're aware that the seizure of the evidence in this case was, for the most part, November 18th of 2003, correct?
That was my recollection from reading the newspapers. I wasn't working at that time.
Alright, is that part of the time that you were retired?
I believe I may have been working as a part-time bailiff a day or 2 a week down in the Santa Barbara courts, or I was basically retired.
There you go. But you were aware that the search in this case occurred November the 18th of 2003, right?
I was aware that there was a search warrant served, yes, sir.
Were you aware that Detective Lafferty had viewed some of the evidence in this case that you ultimately did a latent print examination on?
No, sir.
Were you aware that there was a, well, let me ask you this. Did you review the reports of other officers?
No, sir.
Not even people involved in the print identification aspect of the case, preservation?
If I had a question, I went directly to the officer or the person involved and asked.
Alright, so were you aware that in December of 2003, that Detective Lafferty wrote a report requesting that the Forensics Bureau please do a fingerprint analysis of this same evidence?
No, I am not.
Now, I understand that you were essentially retired and coming back and doing some part-time work during that period of time. But based on your training and experience working in the Forensics Bureau, when somebody makes a request, another officer makes a request for a fingerprint analysis. Is that something that the Forensics Bureau is supposed to attend to?
The forensics unit I would say, is more of a reactionary unit than an offensive unit. So he would have run his request up the chain of command, and then it would be up to whoever's up making those decisions, and then decide how the unit was to proceed.
Based on your experience, forget about this case for a moment. Based on your experience, you said you worked other cases where there were fingerprints, correct?
Yes, sir.
And you actually did fingerprint analysis and comparison, correct?
That's correct, sir.
Alright, and in cases where there are fingerprints on objects, or there may be fingerprints on objects that are seized, is it customary for somebody in law enforcement to say, preserve this so that it can be checked for prints?
When prints, I don't know how to answer this. Not all the time, no. It depends. It's up to the investigating officer as to what action he wants to take with his evidence, I guess would be a way to put it.
Alright, if an investigating officer looks at items out at the scene at the time of the seizure, and forms the opinion that somebody ought to check these things for prints, do you expect that to be communicated to the forensics unit?
Yes, sir. Normally they would write up a work request on one of our forms. Send it in, the evidence would be booked in, and then we'd deal with it.
And ordinarily that would occur very early in the proceedings, correct?
Sometimes. This is the first time I've seen it where it's come up a year later.
It came up a year later here, didn't it?
Objection. Argumentative.
Sustained.
Other than this case, have you seen prints analyzed by your department a year later that were intended to be analyzed at the time the item was seized?
I did one 2.5 years later, but I don't know what the intent was when it was seized. But sometimes there's a timeline that runs.
Alright, so I'm talking about a case where you're investigating out in the field. The lead detective or the detective assigned to seize the evidence says, yeah, we better check that for prints. Isn't it the policy and procedure of your office, the sheriff's office, to have those items sent to the forensics unit within a reasonably short period of time to do the print analysis?
Again, that's up to the investigator in charge of that particular case as to what time, when they want to run, or what they want to do, what tests, or what's done.
And you would expect that there would be some request, there would be a forensic request, is that right? Let me withdraw that so we can be clear. There's a form that you have in your office that can be filled out by the lead detective, or whoever seizes the evidence, to request forensic analysis of an item of evidence. Is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
Alright, did you see any such forms in this case?
I received a work form filled out in, I believe it was, July was the date on it.
July of 2004?
Yes, sir.
So you did not see a forensic request for fingerprints that was dated before July of 2004. Is that correct, sir? In this case.
No, and I had very little contact with the unit prior to July of 2004.
I'm asking if you saw. I'm not asking whether or not you had contact. The question is, did you see a forensic request form that was dated any time prior to July of 2004?
No, sir, I did not.
Alright, let me get may I approach, Your Honor?
Yes.
I'm going to show you 743, 744 and 745. You were looking at those. Can I put them right here?
Sure.
Alright, you've got 743, 744, 745, and whose prints? These are exemplar prints, correct?
Yes, sir.
And whose prints on which board?
Okay, on item 743, we have Mr. Jackson's fingerprints. On item 744, we have Star Arvizo's fingerprints. And on 745, we have Gavin Arvizo's fingerprints.
Alright, now, you talked about basic class characteristics. That is, whorls, loops, and arches, correct?
Correct, sir.
Can you tell us, with regard to 743, those fingerprints, what configuration do those fingerprints show?
Do you want me to read all 10 off?
You can do that.
Well, the right thumb is a right slant loop. The right index is a right slant loop.
Slow down, please.
Excuse me. The right middle is a right slant loop. The right ring is a right slant loop. The right little is the right slant loop. The left thumb is a left slant loop. The left index is an arch. The left middle is an arch. The left ring appears to be a central pocket loop whorl. And the left little is a left slant loop.
Okay, go to 744. Now, that's the one where you've got two sets, is that correct?
That's correct, sir.
So you're going to pick your best set and tell us from that, correct?
Okay, the right thumb is a right slant loop. The right index appears to be a left slant loop, or a tented arch. The right middle is a right slant loop. The right ring is a right slant loop. And the right little is a right slant loop. The left thumb is a left slant loop. The left index appears to be either a tented arch or a right slant loop. The left middle is a left slant loop. The left ring appears to be a left slant loop. And the left little appears to be a left slant loop, but they're somewhat hard to see.
Alright. And then on 745?
On 745, the right thumb is a right slant loop. The right index is a left slant loop. The right middle is a right slant loop. The right ring is a right slant loop. And the right little appears to be a right slant loop. The left thumb is a left slant loop. The left index is a left slant loop. The left middle is a left slant loop. The left ring is a left slant loop. And the left little is a left slant loop.
Alright, so the predominant feature of all of the fingerprints and cards are that these fingers are looped fingerprints, is that correct? I think you said there were a couple on Mr. Jackson's where it was an arch or a tented arch.
Mr. Jackson has two arches in a central pocket loop whorl. I think everything else is a loop pattern.
All of the exemplar prints, except for those, are loops, correct?
Appear to be, yes, sir.
And what percentage of the population has looped fingerprints?
About 65%.
Alright, Your Honor, what I'd like to do is go to the PowerPoint version of the exhibits. And let me just see if I have the right number here. Alright, what this should be. You can have that back, if you want. I think you wanted it. With the court's permission, I'm going to put up 758. And I'm not going to go through all of these. They're in evidence, but just to do it quickly. This is number 13 of the 19 cards. Is that correct, sir?
It's from 317, why? The exact number I'm not sure. Oh, 13 at the bottom, yes, sir.
Down at the bottom. Basically, so we don't get any more confused than we need to, there are 19 of these cards?
That's correct.
And these are the 19 cards where you showed your comparisons, your points of comparison, correct?
Yes, sir.
Alright, so I'm just taking this one. Now, if you look at 317, why? If you look at the latent print that's contained in this exhibit, that is a partial print, correct?
Correct.
And it appears that there may be some torquing or there may be actually another print involved in the latent. Is that correct?
There's distortion and it could actually, yes, there's distortion in the print, which has caused it to distort somewhat, yes.
Alright, now, in order to rule out the dissimilarities, you have to account for the dissimilarities as distortion, correct?
There is a difference between a dissimilarity and a distortion.
Precisely. And you have to make that determination, right?
That's correct.
Because if something doesn't look the same, putting it in very basic terms, it either is going to eliminate that print from the comparison, or you have to explain it as a distortion, correct?
Yes, sir. But at the same time, you're looking for dissimilarities that come up in the wrong spot in regards to ridge flow and spatial alignment.
Okay, I'm going to go to 759. Now, here you have another partial print, 759. And it actually looks like whoever did the location of this print actually wrote over part of the ridge detail with a black marker. Is that correct?
There is a black marker pen on the lower right of the latent print, yes. However, whether it obliterated any usable ridge detail, I'd have to examine that print closely to determine that.
Now, either I'm looking at it backwards or something.
Lower left.
Lower left and then across the top, is that right?
Correct. There's a ruler on the right side.
And I'm going to go to 762, which I believe is that. Once again, there you have. Somebody has used a black marker pen to note the location of a print, and has actually obliterated a part of the latent print. Is that correct?
They've marked through it, but, again, it doesn't appear that they have, for the most part, disturbed any usable friction ridge detail.
Well, and that's because the usable friction ridge detail is only what you can see. If you can't see under it, you don't know what's under there, right?
Well, in that blurred area on the right would be an unusable area anyway.
Let's talk about that. The blurred area on the right is not shown in the exemplar print, correct? In other words, that is not identical to the exemplar print, the blurred area on the right?
I can't tell.
Okay, as you look at it, you cannot identify it as being identical to the exemplar print, correct?
Yes, sir, but, go ahead.
Okay, and can you tell what caused the blurred area on the right?
It was probably either distortion, or there was a slippage when the print was laid on the paper, or something else touched the paper. Not knowing what exactly happened to this, I can only make some assumptions.
Alright, and similarly here on number 764, there are some marks, striations, or whatever they are, at the top of the print that are not shown in the exemplar print, correct?
That's correct, sir.
And you account for that as distortion, is that correct?
That would be slippage at that point.
And that's your assumption, is that that's slippage?
Yeah, it appears that the finger had touched the page and pulled down slightly, and then the rest of the finger sat down on the page, creating a latent fingerprint.
Alright, okay. Your Honor, we can turn the screen off, if that's alright. Alright, and I have no further questions at this time.
Counsel?
Thank you, Your Honor. May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
Yes.
Detective Spinner, I'm going to approach you with Exhibit 726, Exhibit 748. Do you recall examining both of those exhibits on Friday?
Yes, sir.
Okay. And during that examination, which I believe I conducted, did I ask you to check the fingerprint depicted in Exhibit 726 and compare it to the fingerprint board, which is Exhibit 748?
Yes, sir.
I'm going to object as hearsay as to what was asked.
Sustained.
Now, Defense Attorney Sanger showed you Exhibit 723 this morning.
Correct.
Do you recall that?
Yes, sir.
Do you recall ever being shown this exhibit during your testimony on Friday?
I don't believe I was, no.
Could you take a look at Exhibit 723 and describe what it is for the jury, please?
Item 723 is a printout of the PowerPoint demonstration created by the Sheriff's Department for Protocol for Latent Fingerprint Processing.
Would you flip through all the pages, please? Do you have a recollection whether you presented that information to the jury on Friday?
No, I did not.
And when was the first time you were asked any questions about testifying as to that exhibit?
This morning.
By Mr. Sanger?
Yes, sir.
Do you recall ever pointing to a fingerprint in Exhibit 723 and saying, "Well, that's the same one that's in Exhibit 748"?
No, sir.
Okay. I think what we'll do is try to work backwards. Your Honor, if I may have input number 4, please. Dim the lights, please. Thank you. I'm placing on the Elmo machine exhibit number 622. Now, Mr. Sanger asked you some questions about when and if you knew when a request for forensic testing came in regarding the magazine seized from the defendant's ranch.
Correct.
I'm going to object. Actually, that misstates the evidence. It was fingerprint examination.
I believe he used the words, forensic testing, Your Honor.
The objection's overruled.
Does forensic testing include sending items out for DNA analysis?
Yes, it does.
Okay. And in the grand scheme of things, if you were going to do a DNA analysis on the same magazines that you would later check for fingerprints, which analysis would be conducted first?
The DNA analysis.
And why is that?
Because the testing process for fingerprints in the development process could contaminate or destroy possibly any DNA.
And by contaminate, what do you mean?
Possibly alter the structure. Since ultraviolet light was being used, it could have damaged the DNA.
And is contamination essentially destruction?
It can be.
Okay. With respect to fingerprint analysis, if you contaminate a fingerprint, what have you done for its usefulness as a print that you can make any conclusions about?
I'm going to object. That's vague as phrased.
Sustained.
Let me resk. With respect to a fingerprint, if you contaminate it, what have you done to its usefulness?
It could possibly make it unusable.
Okay. And what kind of forms of contamination can affect a fingerprint in that respect?
Any activity which would destroy the ridge detail or blur the ridge detail so it could not be observed or traced or used for a latent comparison purpose. Cloud the clarity of the print.
Okay. With respect to the DNA testing, do you have experience sending items to the Department of Justice Laboratory in Goleta for that very purpose?
I have sent a few out, but it's been several years.
Okay. In your experience, does DNA testing or screening from potential DNA testing take some period of time?
To my recollection.
Objection. Lack of foundation.
Sustained.
Sergeant Spinner.
Yes.
The objection was sustained.
Do you have knowledge of how long the items that you've sent to the Department of Justice for DNA testing have taken to come back?
Objection. Lack of foundation and relevance.
The foundation objection is sustained.
You have sent items to the DNA lab in Goleta, correct, for testing?
Yes, sir.
Asked and answered.
Overruled. Next question.
You requested that DNA examination be done on the items that you've sent?
We sent items to the DOJ at the request of detectives for DNA analysis.
Okay. And in your experience, do you find the turnaround time for when you receive the items back to be a long period or a short period?
Objection. Vague and lack of foundation, relevance to this case.
Overruled. You may answer.
Depending on which lab was used, it could take quite some time.
With respect to the magazines and other sexually explicit content that you were asked to conduct fingerprint experiments, or fingerprint examinations on, do you know whether any of those items had been sent to DOJ in early February of 2004 for DNA testing?
Objection. This was asked and answered on direct. Beyond the scope.
Overruled.
You may answer.
I knew that items were at the DOJ lab for testing. I don't know when they were actually sent out.
Okay, so you knew the time frame they had been sent out was
prior to my attempting to.
Excuse me. I'm going to object. It's not a question. No question pending.
Sustained.
okay.
Let's take our morning break.